Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this webinar about reviewing the evidence, what works in disability employment services. I'm Craig Thornton, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which is brought to you by the Mathematica Center for Studying Disability Policy. The center was established in 2007 to help build the evidence base for sound, effective disability policy. Given that disability touches virtually every aspect of a person's life, center researchers have looked at a wide spectrum of programs and policies, including child development, education, community living, healthcare, income support, and much, much more. Today, we're going to highlight work related to employment. And not so long ago, the main question about employment for people with disabilities was feasibility, whether or not people with serious limitations in functioning or impairments could hold jobs in the regular labor market. And given that uncertainty, it was not so surprising that public policy at the time tended to look for ways to provide long-term supports for people who were not expected to participate much in the labor force or the community life, for that matter. Now, fortunately, we're well past that question now, and people with disabilities widely participate in labor markets and communities, although they're still employed at lower rates than their non-disabled peers, and public policy continues to operate within a legacy of programs often designed more than 40 years ago. So along with public policy and what's going on in people's lives, we've seen policy research also change. Rather than focusing just on whether or not people with disabilities could work, today's research focuses on finding the most effective ways to support people who have limitations in functioning and help them reach their full potential. That is, we're now asking, how can we reform systems that had their origins back in the is it feasible era to fit current technology, labor markets, and individual aspirations and capabilities? As the questions have changed, also so have the methods. Today, we're much more likely to see sophisticated evaluations that look to attribute changes in outcomes, changes in employment and community living, to specific programs or policies, and to do so with a high degree of confidence. So in talking about employment, we have three really great teams of Mathematica researchers today. We're going to look at some intriguing answers to the question about how do you move forward using current programs to increase employment for people with disabilities. First, Priyanka Anand will be talking. She's a senior researcher at Mathematica and will address, does expanding post-secondary education supports to state vocational rehabilitation agency clients represent a promising avenue to helping transition-age youth make a transition to adult life. Next, Heinrich Hock, a senior economist at Mathematica, will discuss, does the Job Corps, a long-standing employment and training program oriented towards disadvantaged youth in general, increase employment and financial self-sufficiency for its participants with medical limitations? And after that, Gina Livermore, a senior researcher at Mathematica, will report on a study of whether changes to vocational rehabilitation service processes can help Social Security disability insurance recipients achieve meaningful levels of earnings and possibly reduce their benefit receipt without actually going in and changing any of the SSDI rules. And finally, Dave Stapleton, a senior fellow here at Mathematica and the director of our center, will discuss these issues and put the findings in a wider context of policy development and research methods. Before we get started with the presentations, our web coordinator, Bryce Overcash, has a few housekeeping reminders for the audience. Bryce?
Thank you, Craig. So at the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets that you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. If you have any questions for presenters during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will address as many questions as possible during this session, but if a more detailed answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. We do capture all questions that are asked during the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. However, you can also submit technical questions through the Q&A widget. Please note most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command+R on Macs to refresh your player console. A copy of today's slide deck and other resources are available in the Resource List widget indicated by the green file icon at the bottom of your screen. Finally, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately one day after today's event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was used to access today's webcast. Now I'll turn it over back to Craig.
Thanks, Bryce. We're eager to use this webinar to share our findings and to hear your reactions, ideas, and suggestions. So again, after Dave gives his comments, we really are going to open it up, and we look forward to your sending in questions or suggestions. And as Bryce noted, use the electronic options available in the Q&A panel on your screen. I'm now pleased to turn it over to our first presenter, Priyanka.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Craig. As mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about long-term outcomes for transition-age youth with mental health conditions who receive post-secondary education support. This work is joint with my colleague, Todd Honeycutt at Mathematica. We conducted this research under a grant from the Social Security Administration through the Disability Research Consortium, but all views are our own and do not reflect that of SSA. So on average, people with disabilities tend to have lower employment outcomes than people without disabilities. In order to close this employment gap, state vocational rehabilitation agencies, or VR agencies, provide services to help people with disabilities achieve their employment goals. The type of services that they provide include things like job placement services or rehabilitation technology and other types of support. The type of support that we are interested in today is support for post-secondary education. We define post-secondary education as going to college or vocational training. And VR agencies typically don't provide these post-secondary education directly, but they will provide things like tuition or books or supplies that are needed. The general literature has shown that post-secondary education can really improve employment outcomes. But past literature has also shown that youth with mental health conditions are often less likely to receive VR support for post-secondary education than youth with other types of disabilities. So in our paper, we are going to examine the relationship between receiving between receiving VR support for post-secondary education and long-term outcomes for youth with mental health conditions. This is an important question because if VR agencies are thinking of expanding support for post-secondary education, it's important to know whether it is correlated with positive employment outcomes. So to these ends, we are interested in two main research questions. The first research question is looking at how do long-term employment and earnings outcomes vary by receipt of post-secondary education support for transition-age youth with mental health conditions. Our second research question is similar to the first research question, but instead of looking at employment and earnings as an outcome, we look at receipt of federal disability benefits, so that would be receipt of SSI or SSDI. The past literature on looking at how VR supports for post-secondary education affect outcomes has really been focused on people with all types of disabilities and not just youth with mental health conditions. And the results from these papers have been really mixed. Some find that post-secondary education support has resulted in higher employment upon VR exit or 2 years after VR exit, while other papers have found that the employment outcomes are lower at VR exit. So there really has been no consensus. There has been one paper that looks specifically at youth with mental health conditions and not just all youth with disabilities. And that paper found that those who received post-secondary education supports were less likely to be employed 2 years after VR exit. However, this study was just conducted for a single state, Virginia. So we contribute to this literature in several ways. So the first is that we focus on youth with mental health conditions. And this is an important population because youth with mental health conditions often have lower employment outcomes than youth with other types of disabilities. And they also make up a large fraction of youth that are applying to VR agencies for support. We also examine outcomes 9 years after VR exit, which is much longer than most of the papers, which typically tend to look at employment at VR exit or just 2 years later. We also look at 3 different types of outcome measures. So in addition to looking at just employment, we also look at earnings, and we look at receipt of federal disability benefits. And finally, we are able to control for national, state, and local factors in our analysis through a regression analysis. We use 3 data sources for our study. The first is the RSA 911, which is an administrative data set that contains information on the VR services that are received from 2002 through 2013. We then merged the RSA 911 with the 2013 Disability Analysis File, or the DAF, and the DAF provides information on the disability benefits that are received throughout this same time period. And then finally, we merged these 2 data sets with the master earnings file, which provides administrative data on earnings throughout this time period. Our final sample size is about 437,000 VR applicants, and we've limited the sample to first-time VR applicants who applied in 2002, 2003, or 2004. So since we have data through 2013, we're able to follow each of these 3 cohorts for 9 years. We also have limited the sample to those who are ages 16 to 24 at the time of application, and just those that were eligible for VR support. So since we don't have much time, I'm going to jump right into the results. So here's looking at our first outcome, which is employment, where we show the employment rates for youth with mental health conditions that are receiving education services, who are receiving services that are not post-secondary education. So they're receiving different types of service. And we show their employment for each year starting in the year before VR application up until the 9th year after their application. And I'm sorry, this is a year exit. There's a mistake there. It's the year before exit and 9 years after exit. And you can see that in the 9th year after exit, about 45% of youth with mental health conditions who received services besides post-secondary education support were employed. So we now compare this to youth with mental health conditions who did receive post-secondary education services. So the blue dashed line, the shorter dashed line on top are youth who received college support, and the green dotted line are youth that received vocational training. And you can see from this graph that youth who received post-secondary education services tended to have higher employment rates than those who did not receive these services. And this is true for every year, including the year before application. So what this indicates is that there is some selection in who receives these services and that they had higher employment even before they received any type of service, but the gap becomes larger over time, suggesting that there is a relationship between receiving post-secondary education services and employment. However, we don't know the direction of causality with this relationship. It could be that receiving these services improves employment, or it also could be that those who are predisposed to be employed are receiving post-secondary education services. Now we look at our next outcome, which is earnings. And again, we are looking at the 9 years after VR exit. And here we can see we are looking at VR clients who did not receive post-secondary education services. And now, just like before, we're going to compare them with VR clients with mental health conditions who did receive college supports and vocational training supports. And here, just as we saw with employment, we see that the earnings gap becomes much larger between those who receive post-secondary education support and those who did not receive post-secondary education support. Once again, we don't know the direction of causality with this relationship, but it does suggest that receiving post-secondary education services is positively associated with higher earnings 9 years after application. We also want to look at whether this relationship still holds after controlling for individual characteristics through a regression analysis. And so we show the results of that regression analysis here. So the 2 bars on the left show the outcome related to employment, which is whether the individual was employed in the 9th year after VR application. and I'm sorry, I did make a mistake. It was the year of application, not exit. So all of this is 9 years after application, and I apologize for that. So on the left side, we look at whether they are employed in the 9th year after application. The blue lines, the blue bar shows the difference between those who receive college support and those who do not receive college supports, and the green lines show the difference between those who receive vocational training and those who do not receive vocational training. On the right side, we show the difference in log earnings in the 9th year after VR application. And in both cases, you can see that even after a regression analysis, this relationship still holds, that those who receive post-secondary education services do have better employment outcomes in terms of being employed in the 9th year after VR application and their earnings in the 9th year application than those that do not receive post-secondary education support. Now we're going to turn to looking at a different outcome, which is receiving SSA benefits. We look separately at those who are already receiving benefits at the time of VR application and those who were not receiving benefits at the time of application. So I'm going to start with looking at youth with mental health conditions who were receiving benefits at the time of application. And on the first row, we look at whether what percentage of youth with mental health conditions who were not receiving benefits at the time of VR application subsequently received them in the 9 years afterwards. And you can see that the percentage is much lower for those that received post-secondary education support than it is for those who received other types of services. It's about 12% for those with post-secondary education support compared to about 19% for those who received other services. Among those who did eventually receive subsequent benefits, the average number of years they received those benefits is similar between those who did and did not receive post-secondary education support. Just as we did for employment and earnings, we want to confirm that these relationships still hold after controlling for individual characteristics. So just like before, the blue lines indicate the difference between those receiving college support and those who didn't receive college support, and the green lines are those who received vocational training versus those who did not receive vocational training. And the descriptive statistics are confirmed here once again, that we do see that the probability that those who receive post-secondary education support through VR, that they had a lower probability of receiving SSA benefits in the subsequent 9 years than those who did not receive post-secondary education support. On the right side, we look at differences in the number of years of benefit receipt among those who did receive those benefits. And we see that there are some small differences, but they are not statistically significant for those who received vocational training. Now we're going to look at youth with mental health conditions who were receiving benefits at the time of VR application and look at whether those benefits were suspended in the subsequent 9 years. And here we see that there is not a large difference in the percentage that had their benefits forgone for work in the subsequent 9 years between those who received post-secondary education support and those who did not. However, among those that did have their benefits forgone for work, those who received post-secondary education support, the average amount of benefits that were suspended is much larger than those who received other types of services. And once again, we find that these results are confirmed through the regression analysis that controls for individual characteristics. So to summarize our findings, for youth with mental health conditions, receiving post-secondary education support was associated with a higher likelihood of being employed in the 9th year after VR application, higher earnings in that year, a lower likelihood of receiving benefit for those who, SSA benefits for those who are not already receiving benefits at VR application, and a larger amount of benefits forgone for work for those who were receiving benefits at VR application. The relationships we have found here are not causal, but they do suggest a positive relationship between receiving post-secondary education support and outcomes. In order to know for sure that these relationships are causal, it would be important to do a rigorous evaluation of these questions, perhaps through a pilot or a randomized pilot through VR agencies. We should also, if VR agencies are considering expanding support for post-secondary education, they should also consider the costs and benefits of providing this type of support. In past work, we estimated that the cost of providing post-secondary education was about $26,000 to $7,000 higher for those youth that received those services than youth who received other types of support. But we also found in this study that the benefits foregone for work for youth who received these services was about $2,100 to $5,000 higher. So when thinking about whether to expand these services, it's also important to consider how much these services cost and the anticipated benefits. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much, and here's my contact information if you have any questions. I will pass this along now to Heinrich Hock.
All right, thank you, Priyanka. So like Priyanka's focus, the focus of the research I'm about to talk about is on transition age youth, and we approach it from a slightly different perspective. We look at how the Job Corps program, a program sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor, could be a potentially promising option for serving youth with disabilities. This is joint work with a few colleagues here at Mathematica, Darrell Lee Luca, Tim Kautz, and Dave Stapleton, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later. Like Priyanka, I'd like to acknowledge the support we received for producing this. We received a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR. And we also should acknowledge that the findings and conclusions are ours, who wrote the paper, and do not represent the policies or views of HHS or NIDLR. So just to step back and give the overview for why we conducted the research, we were prompted by this ongoing discussion about how to better serve youth with disabilities as they transition to the adult labor market. As has been pointed out, these youth have challenges finding employment as adults, especially those who have other barriers. And there's an ongoing discussion among researchers, policymakers, and practitioners about how to help them better achieve their employment goals as adults. And the existing models that provide targeted employment supports for youth with disabilities have a mixed record of success and have not been shown generally to reduce reliance on supplemental security income, so reliance on long-term disability benefits. And so we approached this from the perspective of looking for new models, and the model we focused on is the Job Corps program, as I mentioned. And to do this, we've reanalyzed data from a randomized experiment that Mathematica conducted for the U.S. Department of Labor in the 1990s, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we focused on a subset of the youth enrolled in that study who identified a medical limitation when they applied. So Job Corps is of particular interest, I think, for a few reasons. One is that it focuses on economically disadvantaged youth. So these are youth, of the youth with disabilities, who might be the ones who have the fewest resources externally or through their parents available to address their functional limitations or to support them on their way to work. Job Corps is also an amazingly comprehensive, intensive, and extensive program. It provides general education, vocational training, soft skills development, work experiences, and at the end, job placement. Job Corps has been around since 1964, and it's the most extensive education and training program outside of the traditional K-12 system. The key features that all of these services are work and career focused. They emphasize learning by doing. The curricula are aligned with industry standards, and there's a lot of employer-based training. In terms of how extensive the services are, 80% of participants in Job Corps live on site at a Job Corps center. On average, they spend 8 to 9 months enrolled in the program. And many of them receive medical services and health education, which also might be of particular benefit to youth with disabilities. And so in light of that, we we focused on youth who were part of this Job Corps evaluation that was conducted using a lottery in the 1990s. These youth were tracked using surveys for 48 months after that lottery was conducted. And so that results in a control group of people who are not allowed access to Job Corps for a period of time that are very comparable to the participants. So that helps get at address the issues of causality and that Priyanka mentioned. Our analysis looked in particular at a group of 472 youth with medical limitations, as we're referring to them, and we're basing that on an intake question into the study. There was a survey given, and the survey asked, do you have any serious physical or emotional problem that limits the amount of work that you can do or other regular daily activities? And this is a self-reported question, but as I'll talk about in a minute, this does seem to differentiate to some extent reasonably strongly between those who do and do not end up collecting SSI benefits. We calculated per participant impacts of Job Corps for this group of youth with medical limitations, and the research questions that we're getting at is, did Job Corps have positive impacts on the outcomes of these youth, particularly for earnings and SSI receipt? And were those impacts bigger than for other youth who did not identify medical limitations when they enrolled? So to give a sense of who these youth with medical limitations are, I mean, I guess it's worth noting that the group of youth with medical limitations that were served by Job Corps in the 1990s aren't necessarily reflective of the broader population of youth with disabilities, and that's reflected in this distribution of self-identified conditions that's in the table on the left. So for example, asthma, allergies, and respiratory conditions is by far the most commonly reported condition. And the reason for this difference between what we'd see here and what we'd see if we were to look at sort of the SSI disability roles and the diagnoses indicated there is that Job Corps during the 1990s tended to screen out youth with more severe medical conditions, conditions that made it unlikely that they would successfully complete the program or that would be costly to treat. Now, this screening condition has been removed since that point, and I'll talk about that a little later. But it's worth noting that among the youth with medical limitations who did not have Job Corps access, this is drawing on data from the lottery control group, the SSI rates, recipiency rates were still pretty high, about 15 to 17% per year drew SSI benefits after random assignment of those who were not allowed access into the Job Corps. And among other youth who did not answer yes to that baseline question on medical limitations, the SSI receipt rate was about 4% to 8%. So again, this baseline question differentiated a group who was more likely to end up being in a long-term disability program had they not had access to Job Corps. Just thinking about the group that through the lottery did not have access to Job Corps, this graph sort of emphasizes what we know, which is that youth with medical limitations tend to have lower labor market outcomes, worse labor market outcomes than other youth. And here there's about a 30 to 40% gap in earnings among the youth with and without medical limitations who did not have access to Job Corps. So the question is, to what extent did Job Corps, another feature of this graph is also that for those youth with medical limitations who didn't have access to Job Corps, there was growth over time. And that's important from an evaluation perspective because it emphasizes the need to have a really strong point of comparison, a comparison group or a control group, as opposed to relying on sort of pre and post changes. And so this next graph, this uses the lottery design to try to get at the impacts of Job Corps to see how much additional earnings gains these youth with medical limitations derived from their participation in the program. And so we compare the youth who participated to basically similar youth who were lotteried out and did not have access to Job Corps. And we see that the impacts were substantial starting in this is all measured relative to the lottery date. So in the second year, impact started to be large, about $3,500 impact on a base level of earnings of $6,200. And years 3 and 4, the impacts were on a little bit above $4,000. So this next graph just draws out the difference between these two lines, and just shows the impact, the difference that's attributable to Job Corps. The blue bars show the impacts for youth with medical limitations that we just talked about, and the green bars on the right show the impacts for other youth who did not identify medical limitations at enrollment. And so one feature about this graph for the youth without medical limitations is that if we look at year one, that encompasses the period where most of the youth are participating in Job Corps. There's about an 8 to 9 month average duration of participation. And so this negative impact that we're seeing for the youth without Job Corps, about minus 2,600, that reflects sort of the crowd out that happens. While people are participating in an extensive program, they're not working. They're hoping to achieve higher earnings in the future by perhaps giving up some today. And we see that for the youth without medical limitations. There's this crowd out effect in the first year where they have lower earnings. And then in years 3 and 4, the positive impacts on their earnings start to emerge. One interesting feature of this, I think, is that this crowd-out effect isn't really apparent for youth with medical limitations, and we did some additional analyses that verified that by looking at, weeks worked and hours worked. And essentially, youth with medical limitations who are participating in Job Corps wouldn't otherwise be working. So and they reap substantial impacts in terms of their earnings afterwards. And so there's some ways a net gain for these participants. These impacts are also large in relative terms, about 40 to 50% of what they otherwise would have earned. And those relative impacts are also a lot larger in comparison to youth without medical limitations. This next graph, the first bar on the left, just summarizes, it stacks together those impacts bars across each of the 4 years for the youth with medical limitations, looking at their earnings. And, so what's represented here is the impact across all 4 years that were studied in the follow-up, that were tracked in the follow-up survey. And so the total impact across those 4 years is $9,700, which is about an almost 30% increase over what they otherwise would have earned over that period had they not had access to Job Corps. And the second bar on the right shows that Job Corps also significantly reduced receipt of supplemental security income over that period. There was a reduction of about $2,000 per participant over that 4-year period, and that represents about half of what they would have otherwise been collecting. Not shown here, but in the paper, which we can talk about in the question and answers if you're interested in, we found substantial variation in these impacts on earnings and SSI receipt across subgroups of youth with medical limitations. This is a very exploratory analysis given the relatively small sample size of small groups of individuals we're looking at. We did find findings a bit like the original National Job Corps study. For example, older youth derived larger impacts from Job Corps participation. But a key new finding that we came across is that the impacts among youth with medical limitations were larger among those who identified medical conditions that had a stronger association with SSI receipt in the control group. So the group that would be more likely to receive SSI benefits without access to Job Corps is the same group that got the largest growth in earnings as a result of their Job Corps participation. So our research provides, I think, some new answers about the Job Corps study and youth with medical limitations who participated in it. I think our findings could suggest that Job Corps is a promising option for how maybe VR agencies could work with Job Corps to meet the mandate under the Workforce Investment and Innovation and Opportunity Act to serve transition age youth with 15% of their funds. And I think the interesting, this also shows a model, an integrated model of an inclusive model of serving youth with disabilities. So this is a model where youth with disabilities are served in the same Job Corps centers, in the same classrooms, in the same vocational training programs as youth who do not have disabilities. As I mentioned before, I think there are some interesting potential differences in the types, across the types of youth with medical limitations that were served that could be explored in the future. And we have other questions that I think we would look forward to answering in the future, particularly about what were the longer-term effects. And here, this gets at the issue Priyanka mentioned about cost-benefit, cost-benefit assessment. Job Corps is an extensive program. During the 1990s, after adjusting for inflation, the average cost per participant was about $25,000. And so the question is, are these large earnings impacts and some other impacts on sort of reduced crime and other measures, are those enough to sort of that Job Corps paid for itself from a social perspective? And the original study found that it did pay for itself for older youth, where the earnings impacts were the largest. And so, I think it would be, we hope to find out more about whether Job Corps was a sort of a net benefit from a social perspective for these youth with medical limitations. Particularly, I think also of interest is the large reductions in SSI benefits that were paid out. And I think we also have some questions that we're interested in understanding about how Job Corps works today to serve youth with disabilities. As I mentioned before, there was in the 1990s this restriction on eligibility based on the severity of the medical condition. That's been dropped. Today, Job Corps, about 20% of Job Corps enrollees identify disabilities. And Job Corps provides extensive accommodations and sort of resource coordinators to serve the complex needs of this group. And so I think it would be interesting to learn more about how Job Corps works today to serve these youth, and is it particularly effective for some of these youth versus others, and how does Job Corps interact with the VR system, and could those linkages be explored more fully in the future? So for more information, you can contact any of the study authors. These are our emails. And with that, I'll pass it off to Gina.
All right, thanks, Heinrich. I'm going to talk today or present some early findings from something called the Substantial Gainful Activity, or SGA, project demonstration. Oops, I think I went the wrong way.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Or keep going the other way.
Okay. This is acting up.
Keep going.
Heinrich didn't tell me he put a bunch of slides behind his last slide. Confused me. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a demonstration called the Substantial Gainful Activity, or SGA, project demonstration. And this is a demonstration that was funded through a grant from the Rehabilitation Services Administration to the University of Massachusetts Institute for Community Inclusion, and Mathematica is a partner with UMass ICI, we're the evaluator for this, and they've been providing TA and helping the states involved with this do the implementation. So the goal of this SGA project was to develop, implement, and evaluate a service model that could be implemented by state VR agencies that would improve the chances that their clients who receive Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, only, and no SSI, would achieve employment and earnings above what SSA defines as the Substantial Gainful Activity, or SGA level. And that's currently $1,170 per month, or at least that's sort of the ballpark for that. So why would the goal be to focus on SSDI-only clients and on SGA level employment? Well, when this demonstration started the grant back in 2010, there was a large growth in the SSDI program, and looking for ways to help SSDI beneficiaries increase their employment, get back to work was imperative, or a prerogative at that time. And most SSDI beneficiaries, just by virtue of them being covered by the program, they have work histories. They have work skills and experience that could be leveraged by VR agencies to help them get back to work. And Substantial Gainful Activity, or SGA, is an important milestone for ongoing SSDI eligibility. If you earn above that for a sustained period of time, you're going to eventually get off of benefits. And it's also an important milestone for VR agencies in that they receive reimbursement from SSA if beneficiaries sustain SGA level earnings for some period. But probably most importantly, that higher earnings are trying to achieve what substantially gainful earnings, not so much the definition in SSA's dollar amounts, but in terms of what really, how can you help people earn more so that they can have substantially better financial well-being. That was really the primary motivation for the demonstration. So 2 states kindly volunteered to conduct the demonstration, Kentucky and Minnesota. And the demonstration involved 4 sort of domains for the innovations. Each state implemented the innovations slightly differently depending on, what their own service environment and what they already had in place at the time. But the 4 components involved, well, the first was to try to speed up the pace of the services and focus on keeping the client engaged and motivated to stay in services and to go back to work. This is somewhat in response to, a lot of time the process can drag out, the application process takes a while, people get put on waiting lists, clients lose interest and fall out of services, So this was in response to trying to keep them engaged, trying to speed things up. And some of the targets were kind of aggressive. So just to give an example, both states had a target of getting the application the eligibility for services determined within 2 days of application. And I think for one of the states, Kentucky, that was a little bit of a challenge because they didn't have, one of the ways you can do that quickly is to use something called presumptive eligibility, where SSDI folks are presumed eligible for VR services. But if you didn't know if they were SSDI, it was hard to do that in 2 days, and it took some time. To get that information in Kentucky took a little longer than it did in Minnesota, so it was a bit challenging. As another example, and a key outcome, which I'll show later, is getting their individualized plan to employment, or IPE, developed within 30 days of application. So these targets represented some challenges for them, but the point of the demonstration was to see if they could develop means for getting through that, and if they could make that work to speed things up. A second component was to enhance their financial education benefits counseling services, and both states had access to these. Every state has a work incentive planning assistance program, and VR agencies in both states would use those. But they added capacity in this regard. But probably more importantly, there was expectations to more consistently send clients to those and to benefits planning services, and also to utilize them and involve benefits planners more early in the process, like get them involved in developing the IPE right away, within, as early as possible in the process, not wait till the end when the client's about ready to go to work to start that. And similarly, employer relations and job development services, both states had job placement specialists. They enhanced their capacity in that area, but again, the key difference was they're going to involve those people earlier, right up front, with the counselor and the benefits planner. They were to have involvement in development of the IPE, so that, it's not at the end, okay, you've had all these services, you're all ready to get a job now, and then job developer has a hard time because maybe they didn't take into account the local labor markets or employer demands, or clients had different expectations about what they wanted to do versus what the market really could get them a job in. So bringing those people in earlier was, hypothesized to result in better outcomes. And finally, and this is probably one of the bigger changes, was having a coordinated team approach, meaning there's the VR counselor, there's the benefits planner, and there's the job placement person. Having them all get together and coordinate over what the client's plan of services is going to be, talking to each other and working as a team to get that person into employment at as high a level as they can. So that also had a rather aggressive timing, or at least some aggressive goals. Like they wanted that team to meet within like the week of the person becoming eligible. So you can imagine that's difficult. It's difficult in my work to get that many people to meet without a week's notice. So that was a challenge for both states. So they began implementing these innovations in mid-2015. So what I'm presenting today is very early findings, and they're the impact findings. I'm not going to talk at all about the experiences of the states, which a lot of people might be interested in. We hope to have another seminar in the fall to talk about that, and the reports are also available on a website, which I'll put up at the end. But focusing on the evaluation itself, this was a rigorous evaluation design. We randomly assigned offices to either implement the SGA project innovations or to be services as usual. And we've grouped the offices. We try to group similar offices into different categories, into strata, and then we randomly assigned. There'd be 2 offices in each strata, and then one was assigned to treatment, one was randomly assigned to control. And there were not a lot of offices in each of these states. Kentucky had 7 treatment and 8 control, and Minnesota ended up having 8 treatment and 9 control offices. And altogether, well, in each state, 1,000 SSDI-only clients were enrolled in the demonstration, 500 being treatment, roughly 500 being treatment, right, and roughly 500 being control. So the advantages of doing this random assignment is it is a rigorous way to see if there's any impact of this service change. And the randomization helps ensure that the treatment and control group members are similar, and so any differences we see in them will be due to the SGA project innovations as opposed to something else. Randomizing at the office level is easier to implement than randomizing each client as they walk in the door, because you just do it once. And it's also easier to allocate. In this case, a lot of the resources for the new services were at an office level or a region level, and so it's easier to allocate those as opposed to at the individual level. And offices only serve treatment or control group cases, so they don't have to keep track of which clients are which, so it minimizes the potential for control group contamination. And it also minimizes counselors' perceptions of ethical dilemmas. If they're giving one of their clients something and another client something else, sometimes it's perceived as an ethical dilemma, even though they may not even know if the new stuff works or if it's any better. So the early impact findings I'm going to present are based on VR case file data on client outcomes during the first 6 months after application. So it's very quick after they first started services. It only includes clients enrolled for at least 6 months, and it only represents about half of all the clients that were enrolled in the demonstration. But we did see that the randomization worked well in terms of the treatment and control clients were very similar to each other. But I want to emphasize how preliminary the findings I'm going to show are, because the sample had not received for services very long, and most cases had not even closed at that time, and so they are preliminary. So I'm going to show 3 outcomes that were of interest, and the first relates to that faster pacing engagement goal, and it's the percent of clients that got their IPE within 30 days of application. And the red bars here show the treatment sites, the ones that got the SGA project innovations, and the black bar is the control group sites. And as you can see, that they were both states were very successful in increasing the share of clients who got their IPEs within 30 days of application. Looking at this, Kentucky was slower to start with, apparently, than Minnesota, but they shaved off almost a month off the median time to the IPE. And Minnesota was able to reduce the median by about 11 days over the control group. So it was a substantial speeding up of the process. So related to employment, and this is the share of all of the cases who had been in services at least 6 months, how many of them were employed or employed in competitive employment, closed with competitive employment. And the numbers are small because it's only 6 months and a lot of people hadn't finished services yet. But as you can see, again, both of the study sites, the treatment sites, were significantly more likely to have their clients close with competitive employment, almost doubling the rate over the control group sites. So the last slide I have on impacts relates to kind of the main goal here, the SGA level earnings, what share of clients close with SGA level earnings. And there were not significant statistically significant differences, I should say, between the treatment and control sites. However, these very early findings suggest that the treatment sites in Kentucky and Minnesota both were achieving SGA level earning case closures at about twice the rate of the control group. And again, these are very preliminary findings, and it's still early. And it looks like it's really small numbers, and it probably is. I mean, once we get the final evaluation findings, which are almost ready, by the way, it's small. It's a small share that get to SGA level earnings, but if you think about, you know, if this doubling implies that the potential revenues to VR agencies might also double related to these types of clients, it's probably not insignificant. So some of the key conclusions from our early findings are that both states substantially increased the pace of services over usual services, and we don't see the signs that this completely, you know, threw the whole system into catastrophe. But we are looking, one of the things we're looking at in the final evaluation is if there was an impact on the non-SSDI clients, because, you know, they might have diverted all their attention to the DI folks, and that's why they're doing better. So we're looking at that in the final evaluation. And both states showed early indications of meeting the SGA project goals of speeding things up, getting more competitive employment closures, and also a greater likelihood of achieving SGA level earnings. Other conclusions, and this isn't minor, you might think this is a evaluation nerdy thing, but both states successfully implemented a clustered random assignment design, and this is no small feat for a VR agency. They're not used to doing studies and, you know, implementing new innovations at the same time you're having to randomly assign sites and train certain people to do certain things, and but they did a great job, and that we were very impressed with what they did and how well this came out, the comparable treatment and control groups. We've had good statistical power on this, as we're finding in the final estimates. They're good enough to detect impacts, and we found no indication that there's contamination going on between treatment and control. So we think it has a lot of potential for rigorously testing other types of VR or other employment service innovations for other types of agencies. Thanks. So I guess I'll turn it over to Dave now.
Thanks, Gina. And for people on the line listening to the webinar, there's been a lot of facts put out by the various speakers here today. And if you have questions, you want a little bit more detail about a number you saw, something clarified, or just another question about the interpretation or application of these results, please use the question and answer Q&A panel on your screen to send us those questions, and we'll get back to them right after Dave gives his remarks about these three papers.
Thanks, Craig. So I've got three topics I want to talk about. The first is, what is the potential for mainstream employment and training programs to help adults with disabilities in terms of employment and earnings? And as many of you who have been in this business for a long time know, back in the 1990s, there was complete segregation between what I think of as mainstream employment programs, the programs offered by under the aegis of the Department of Labor, and employment programs for people with disabilities, which were all primarily under the Vocational Rehabilitation Service in a completely different department, the Department of Education. And since that time, of course, there has been much more integration of the programming, and it actually while VR is still run by an agency in education, they're both under the same legislation now, and there's been a significant effort in the last 15 years to try to make the mainstream employment programs more accessible to those who have disabilities. Mathematica has been conducting rigorous program evaluations of mainstream employment programs for a long time, And so when I first came here, I started asking my colleagues which programs they thought were the most successful of the mainstream programs they evaluated. And when we talked about youth and young adults, the answer was always Job Corps. And so I also asked them, well, have these evaluations ever looked at impacts for clients with disabilities? And the answer to that was always no. And that eventually led to the Job Corps analysis and findings that Heinrich has presented. And because of that analysis, we now know that the limited number of youth with medical limitations that were allowed to enroll in the National Job Corps study in the 1990s had impacts on earnings that were substantially larger than for other enrollees over 4 years. And their receipt of SSI benefits was cut in half. And as Heinrich pointed out at the end of his talk, these questions raise many interesting questions about Job Corps today and how well it has exploited its potential to serve youth with more significant disabilities. From my perspective, this line of inquiry needs to go beyond Job Corps to ask questions about how well other mainstream employment and training programs serve individuals with disabilities and their potential for doing more. And in substantial part, because of the leadership from the Department of Labor, states have really undertaken significant efforts to make these programs more accessible. And as an example, Mathematica is conducting what's called the WIA Gold Standard Evaluation, which is a rigorous impact evaluation of the employment and training services authorized under the Workforce Investment Act, the predecessor of the WIOA. And of course, it was started before all of these disability access initiatives were started. And the interim findings from that study show that there were substantial impacts for the intensive services offered to one of the treatment groups. But it turns out, again, that there's a small sample of enrollees with medical limitations at baseline. And so my colleagues are now getting started on working to produce impact estimates for that subgroup. So we hope we'll have impact estimates for them not too distant future, but I think the bigger hope is that going forward for mainstream employment programs, that those who have medical limitations, disabilities, impairments, or whatever you want to call it, will be an important subgroup for the analysis. The second point I want to make is the concerns the importance of rigorous impact evaluations for employment support innovations for people with disabilities. So both the Job Corps study and the SGA study that Gina talked about provide examples of rigorous impact evaluations. The key feature of a rigorous impact evaluation is that outcomes for program participants are compared to a credible, unbiased estimate of what their outcomes would have been if they had not participated in the program, the so-called counterfactual outcomes. Knowing the outcomes of participants alone is often not enough to know if the program helped the participants to achieve those outcomes, or maybe they would have had those outcomes anyway, we just don't know. But of course, it's notoriously difficult to estimate the counterfactual outcomes, and that's one reason why it doesn't happen very often. Both of these studies use randomized control groups for that purpose, and that's of course considered to be the gold standard, but there are other approaches that can be used as well. Largely, I think because, again, counterfactual outcomes are so hard to estimate, program administrators and policymakers have come to routinely rely on just participant outcomes to measure program performance without regard for the counterfactual. And I want to use the Job Corps results to show why that is a mistake. So this graphic here shows you for the fourth year what the mean earnings were of the two groups that Heinrich looked at, the youth with medical limitations at baseline and then everybody else. And what they show you is that their mean earnings in year 4 for the youth with medical limitations was significantly lower than for the other group. And if you're an administrator and you're judged on what the earnings outcomes are just without comparison to a counterfactual of your clients, then you're going to favor serving these youth without medical limitations. And in fact, you may want to send these other youth off to somewhere else, the VR agency or something. And that, I think, in fact, historically is what has happened. But now let's take a look at the impact estimates for the same group. And so in other words, we're comparing the totals, the height of the bars, to the heights for the control groups, the corresponding control groups. And what we see here is that the impacts for the youth with medical limitations are actually quite a lot higher in year 4 than for other youth. $4,304 versus $1,699. In percentage terms, the difference is even bigger, 38% versus 11%. So if you're a program administrator who's being judged on the impacts that your services have, you want, bring those youth with medical limitations on, because we can do really well with them, right? So that you get a whole different approach by administrators. Historically, I think many of you know that vocational rehabilitation research has focused on measurement of outcomes, not impacts. I think there has been a rich history of outcome measurement. Priyanka's presentation provides what is really an excellent example of such a study. By matching Rehab Services Administration data and SSA data, they were able to follow outcomes for 10 years, both employment and program participation outcomes. And they found that over the 10 years, the youth who were provided with post-secondary support, the youth with mental health conditions, had significantly better outcomes. And as Priyanka noted, we can't definitively say whether those post-secondary supports actually were the cause of those better outcomes. It would be great if we could do a rigorous impact evaluation to confirm that. But I think the importance of the study is it demonstrates the possibility that that's in fact true, and tells us it would be really important to go take the next step. Administrators and policymakers would really like to have a lot more information. But right now, the evidence of impacts in vocational rehabilitation is really very scarce. The good news is that I think there's going to be a lot more rigorous impact evaluation in the future. That's partly because policymakers are demanding it, as evidenced by 2 institutions within the Department of Education and the Department of Labor, respectively, the What Works Clearinghouse and the Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation Research, which are both focusing on understanding what the rigorous impact evidence is, but also on getting their agencies to produce more rigorous impact evidence. So that's one thing. There's just demand for that sort of information. But we also have a number of technological and methodological innovations that are due to advances in information technology and concurrent advances in evaluation methods that are taking advantage of information technology. So all of these are leading to lower costs for implementation, data collection, and analysis of rigorous tests, reduced disruption of normal operations when tests are being conducted, sometimes no disruption at all. They can yield results more quickly than have been able to in the past, and they can also address the practical and ethical limitations of randomized controlled trials, which I think in many times has prevented them from being used in the past. I think I will just mention the SGA study briefly as illustrating one of the ways that we've been able to address problems with randomizing at the office level as opposed to the individual level, which I think both address some practical concerns with the nature of the innovation and how to randomize it, but also ethical concerns that the counselors had. So just to sum up, then I really try to, using the presentation, try to illustrate 3 points. One is that the potential for mainstream employment and training programs to help people with disabilities seems to be high based on the Job Corps study, but it's been little explored in the past, and I hope that we'll be seeing more rigorous efforts to do that in the future. The second is rigorous impact evaluations of employment support innovations for people with disabilities are really vital. They're being demanded, and people need them in order to make good decisions about how to invest our limited resources on helping them work better. And finally, we can look forward, I think, to more impact evaluations in the future as some of the barriers to conducting them have been lowered and demand for the results is becoming greater. Thank you very much. Craig?
Thanks a lot, Dave. Let me remind people that we do have a number of questions, and Steve will be reading them, and then we'll put them up on the screen here, I think, as well. But continue to send the questions in if you have something that you'd like us to address. So Steve, you want to bring up some of the questions?
So this first question is, I believe it's for Bianca from Kirsten Rowe, who asks, did you control for differences between those who received non-post-secondary versus college versus vocational training?
And did we control for? So our analysis, the regression analysis, we were looking at basically the difference between receiving each type of post-secondary education support and not receiving that. So in one analysis, we were looking at, if you received support for college, what was your outcome compared to somebody who was not receiving that support and receiving some other type of service. So those were actually the adjusted estimates that I was presenting. And then we also did, in that same analysis, we were looking at, well, what was the difference in your outcome if you received vocational training versus not receiving vocational training. And then what we were controlling for were all the other individual, not all, but as many individual characteristics as we had in our data. So we controlled for things like age or gender, and so that was the intent behind the analysis, was to get at those differences between service receipt. So hopefully that answered your question.
And this next question is for Heinrich, and it comes from Angie Lawson from the state of Minnesota. And she asks, while the increases for YML who participated in Job Corps were statistically significant, I wonder what the real-life impact was. Does the increase impact their other benefits? Do they have increased self-efficacy, et cetera?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. So we observe the impacts for measurable things that we can record in surveys and administrative data sets. So earnings. We can observe reductions in SSI receipt, which in some ways could be read as an indicator of self-reliance, that you are earning above the you're earning to the point where your SSI entitlement is offset to zero, or perhaps you've demonstrated that you're able to work in the labor market. But I think more speaking to this point, the data that we have aren't geared towards getting at things like efficacy or self-reliance, and I think that's where room for qualitative research comes in. The original Job Corps study included that was conducted in the 1990s, had a rich sort of what they call a process study that used qualitative interviews, discussions with participants, discussions with Job Corps counselors to help understand how the program really played out in participants' lives, or how they responded to it, how they perceived it, how they understood their own circumstances. And I think that sort of a qualitative study could be very helpful. At that time, they weren't, as Dave mentioned, they weren't looking specifically at youth with medical limitations or youth with disabilities. I think they weren't even aware of their participation in the program. But that's the type of maybe that's a sort of a complement to what Dave talked about in terms of additional research that can be done. Perhaps I mentioned at the end, Job Corps changed a lot. It serves about 20% of its enrollees nowadays identify disabilities. I think there's one of these process studies that could be done to help understand their experiences and understand their self-efficacy.
Let me just make another comment. I think that's a very good question, and we wish we knew more to answer it. I think we did see some other indicators that lives had improved in ways such as, I think, reduced involvement with the criminal justice system to some extent. But I think, I guess my presumption is that these individuals were doing what they did by choice. The fact that they had higher earnings and lower benefits, they chose to do that. They had an opportunity to do that, and that was their choice. And so I think my presumption is that they are better off than if they had not been in Job Corps. But just how much better off, we really don't know, because we can't observe the types of indicators that I think you'd like to be seeing.
Dave, yeah.
This next question is for Gina from Jen Rigger, who asks, do you have access to the DAF for cross-reference to SSA earnings data? Also, does your evaluation have a longitudinal component? How long will you track these folks post-closure?
That's a great question. We would love to have matched this to SSA administrative data. I think in the original plan, we were going to try to make that happen. The way the demonstration rolled out and the timing of things, we aren't able to do a longer term. But we do know that RSA is interested in doing some kind of a longer term evaluation, whether it's by Mathematica or not. I don't know, but there is interest in following this group, and I will say the outcomes we're seeing in the final evaluation are very promising, and I think it would be of interest to do a longer-term evaluation of this. But at this point, we don't know if that's actually going to happen. And as part of this project, we're also developing some tools that states can use to do their own kinds of evaluations. So it is entirely possible that Kentucky and Minnesota could do their own longer-term evaluation of this, not the SSA benefit receipt side of things, but using unemployment insurance wage data to see longer-term outcomes on unemployment.
Actually, Jen just followed up in the widget here, and she asked, is the lack of DAF access a data exchange / bureaucratic issue?
No, but maybe partly, but the DAF comes out too late for our benefit. You know, there's like a 2-year lag, and this demonstration started in 2015, and the 2015 DAF is just becoming available to match with the RSA data. And there's also, we don't, as the evaluator, have the SSN. So there's a lot of logistical things that would have to be done, and a lot of time would have to pass before we could effectively use the DAF RSA match. And right now, the RSA data only has closures, so that's another issue. We wanted to be able to look at people. For the long term, that's not a problem. But there is a possibility of using that, and that's we've even in our discussions and our thinking about long-term design. That was the match. The RSA match DAF data was exactly what we were thinking of using for this.
This next question is for Dave from Harry Beatty, who asks, what are good sources for more information on technological advances that make rigorous impact evaluation more available?
Yes, that's a good question. So actually, we have a center at Mathematica called CIRE, right?
CIRE, Center for Improving Research Evidence.
Research Evidence. So they have their own website. So it's CIRE, Center for Improving Research Evidence. And I think if you go there, you may find, you're likely to find some issue briefs as well as longer papers that address various methodological issues. I think there's one on rapid cycle evaluation, I can remember. One's on using data analytic methods and big data to do evaluations, administrative data. So that would be my first suggestion. And I don't think I have a second one.
Well, and also I think we're working increasingly to develop toolkits that can be used out in the field to do, by evaluation researchers and by sort of local or state offices to do these sorts of things. One of these tools is a thing called RCT Yes, which was developed for the Department of Education. That is an analysis toolkit where if you provide the data into it and a definition of what your comparison group is, it'll chug through and use kind of state-of-the-art evaluation.
RCE Coach.
Well,
the other one is the Rapid Cycle Evaluation Coach, which is a toolkit that's geared. So RCT Yes is an evaluation toolkit, a comprehensive one. RCE Coach, Rapid Cycle Evaluation Coach, is a toolkit that really helps build the resources and structure to do sort of fast turnaround evaluations of sort of smaller changes, maybe
that's the
moderate
toolkit
changes.
we're doing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is what we're building on this SGA project, is a modified version of that tool so that VR agencies can use it.
And the goal of this is sort of continuous improvement, that you keep trying, maybe instead of does the program work versus does it not work, you try new things, maybe even strong innovations like the one Gina is talking about, and get fast information about whether they work, and then you keep adjusting based on your information in a rigorous framework.
Yeah, I think the RCE coach, one way to describe it is it's a do-it-yourself software for a rigorous impact evaluation that is similar in spirit to doing do-it-yourself tax software.
Yeah, it doesn't require a high-paid statistician or a high-paid
Yeah,
accountant.
that's right. It's we designed it to put Mathematica out of business. So it takes you through a bunch of questions, helps you set up your research plan and the data, and then once you've got your data, it chunks through it and gives you a result and writes you a little report. So it's that sort of cookbook sort of thing, but it's in its early stages, but it's already does some pretty remarkable things, and we'll keep working to make it more available. It's already out there publicly in the public domain and can be used now, but it's really designed for local school systems. So the version we're working on will be designed to support VR agencies, and I suspect there'll be more in the future.
I'd also add another resource, David. You mentioned the What Works Clearinghouse, and the Clearinghouse has made it really part of its mission to articulate what its standards are for rigorous research that will be presented by the Clearinghouse. So you look at those standards, see what kind of criteria they're holding studies up to, and they often have then resources for, what does it mean to do this or how to accomplish these things. So there's a lot of resources available there too.
And that's also true about CLEAR. CLEAR is, I think, has less of a history than the What Works Clearinghouse, but it's in the Department of Labor versus Education for What Works Clearinghouse.
And Department of Labor's CLEAR also has put out, they do these compilations of the systematic evidence reviews, and they've put out a brief on, or a small report on what works for people with disabilities.
All right, this next question is for every presenter today. The general question: what are the roles, impacts, needs, and processes of employer involvement in the career development, vocational rehabilitation, and employment of youth with disabilities?
Said youth, so I'm throwing that at you too.
I think one of the things that we have learned over maybe 10 years or so in doing research on youth with disabilities, transition age, young adults, is that getting them engaged with an employer quickly, giving them employment experiences, seems to be an instrumental piece to their success. You can see that in youth transition demonstration, which is an SSA demonstration that we evaluated recently. I think Job Corps is very much employer-oriented and aimed at providing early experiences. In the SGA project that Gina talked about, getting the youth attached to a job placement person early and figuring out how to interface with the employer was very important. We've got other projects going on that we're evaluating. Pathways, I guess, is the one that for Source America, which also has this goal of getting people experiences with employers. Some people may be familiar with Project Search, also a big deal. Employers play a huge role there. So I think what we're seeing is that the role of employers in getting youth with disabilities attached to employers quickly or getting them employment experiences is really, really important. So anything that a program or a policy can do to
entice
employers, support, get employers involved is likely to be positive.
I think it's also worth noting that in I guess what you would call the traditionally mainstream workforce system, right, the Department of Labor system, there's a lot of there's a growing emphasis and an increased goal of getting employers involved in what they call career pathways models or sectoral employment or apprenticeship type models where basically the employers help define the curriculum and there's an emphasis on placement in work experiences. And so to the extent that more of that is happening in the broader Department of Labor workforce system and 20% of, say, Job Corps participants are identifying as having a disability now, I think that just building these processes that are kind of occurring outside of the disability-focused employment support system will still have pretty strong benefits, hopefully, for youth with disabilities as they transition to adulthood.
And it may be worth mentioning, too, that in another area we do work, not concerning youth so much, but workers who have established careers and who experience medical problems and may, are at risk for leaving the labor force and getting Social Security disability benefits. I think the consensus there is to be successful in helping them stay in the labor force, the employer's role is extremely important, and you want to help them while they're still employed, and you want to make it in the interest of the employer to keep their workers in the workplace. It's not easy to do, but again, I think the recognition that the employer plays a critical role and needs to be encouraged, enticed to be supportive is really, really important.
All right, this next question is for Priyanka from Ryan Odland, who asks, does the recipient of college support qualify for even higher earning and have a better chance of securing employment if they enroll in graduate school?
I can't say that we looked at that. Unfortunately, I don't know that. From the data we have, we only observe whether they receive support for college. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay, this next question is for Gina from Georgia Green, who wonders, is there an increase in cost of services connected with the changes to services?
That's a great question. And certainly the demonstration, some of the grant money was used to enhance the services at the sites. And what we would like to do, but I'm not sure we're going to have time to do it given when the grant ends, is to really look at that more carefully, or at least to put the impact findings, the impacts that we're seeing in that context of what were the extra costs and what's the potential extra revenues. I mean, that's the simplest way of looking at it in terms of the immediate costs and revenues to the VR agency. The broader costs and benefits, we really won't be able to look at because, as we said before, we're not looking at how SSA benefits are affected and that sort of thing. It could be looked at in a longer-term perspective, but I don't know that we're going to have some information on that in the final evaluation, but it probably will be a little bit unsatisfactory in terms of really getting an idea of is this something that could pay for itself, in other words, for VR agencies.
Gina, let me ask you a related question, which may provide a hint at the answer. Your answer to it might is, to what extent are Minnesota and Kentucky planning to continue the innovations or even use them for other clients going forward? Do you know?
We have some idea about that, and I would, I don't want to talk about what these states are planning to do, but yes, we do know that they are adopting some of these features of the demonstration, or attempting to adopt some of them permanently. But I don't want to go too far in that because I'm obviously not a state person. And
All right, I think this next question is for Heinrich, but I'm not sure. The question is there evidence of what works in employment services for youth with mental disabilities in the acronym LMICF?
I think that's not a question for me because I don't study youth with mental disabilities. Maybe that's for you, given the focus of your...
Sorry, for LMI.
LMICS.
I'm not sure what that is, unfortunately. So I'm not sure if I can answer it either.
Okay.
Well, I think the broader question is, are there evidence-based approaches for that population? And we know there are for adults. I don't know, but for transition-age youth.
Well, there is research going on about supported education for youth with significant mental illness. I would, if that person would send an email to the Disability Center, the address there. Well, to any one of us, actually. You've got our email address.
The slides will be available. They can use one of them.
Yeah, we can refer you. We do have experts in that area at the company, but none of us are them. So we can ask them to answer the question.
Okay. This next question is for Priyanka. What are examples of post-secondary education support? Is it monetary to pay for books, tuition, etc., or actual support to help participants as they engage in post-secondary education?
Yeah, so the former is typically what it is. They're usually providing tuition for them to participate in college or vocational training, and they'll also provide, if they need books or any type of equipment that they need. Not equipment's not the right word, but whatever type of support they need to actually enroll in college or vocational training. They're not typically providing these educational services directly. They're just providing support for them to attend. But it should also be said that there's a lot of variation in what exactly is provided by VR agency. But typically it is tuition and books and supplies. Supplies is the better word for it.
Priyanka, it's not a stipend to live on while they're in school, is it?
No, it's a tuition. Mm-hmm.
And they typically don't provide counseling support for helping them, deal with their mental illness or anything like that.
I haven't read that specifically,
Yeah.
but it is possible that if that is considered the support that they need, that perhaps there are VR agencies who provide that. But it's interesting because when we looked at another paper that we wrote looking at just the provision of support for post-secondary education services for youth with mental health conditions, we saw that there was a huge variety. I mean, both in terms of the prevalence of providing this type of support and what they provide. So in some states, maybe 4% of youth with mental health conditions were receiving the support, and other states it was over 50%. And similarly, some were providing, VR agencies just differed in what exactly they provided. But it was fairly consistent that they were not providing the actual educational services. They were providing the support so that people could get could go to college or participate in vocational training.
Is there one more question, Steve? Yeah.
So this question is for Gina. I think this is our last question. Are there implications for early intervention for those still attached or loosely attached to the workforce in the SGA model?
Well, that would be a super speedy way to engage clients with services to get them earlier. There was nothing. These were people already on SSDI, so there is no early intervention once you're at that point. It's not early anymore. So there's nothing in the SGA model that was implemented that you might consider as early intervention. For instance, they didn't target people that were new SSDI beneficiaries versus other folks. Certainly the features of the SGA project innovations could be applied in an early intervention framework or in a targeting of people, either applicants before they get on the rolls or some other context. But it was not done here, and so we have nothing to say about that. But certainly potentially could be.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks to the audience for joining in. We really would like to see the work used, and we're anxious to engage with the audience and find ways that we could apply the findings or new ideas for research. So every author put contact information up. The slides will be available. This whole webinar will be available in a day or so on our website. So feel free to contact the authors if you had more questions or interesting ideas about how to extend what you've heard here. Appreciate it, and thanks to everybody here on the panel. Have a good day now. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this webinar about reviewing the evidence, what works in disability employment services. I'm Craig Thornton, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which is brought to you by the Mathematica Center for Studying Disability Policy. The center was established in 2007 to help build the evidence base for sound, effective disability policy. Given that disability touches virtually every aspect of a person's life, center researchers have looked at a wide spectrum of programs and policies, including